Okay, welcome everybody to tonight's event or talk. I'm Dr. Brandon Boylan in the Political Science Department. We have two guests with us tonight who we're so appreciative came to be with us in person here in Schaible Auditorium. Let me introduce both of them. And many people know Dr. Amy Lovecraft, my colleague in the Political Science Department, Director of the Center for Arctic Policy Studies at UAF. She's going to be moderating a discussion with our two guests tonight. We have Mr. Erec Isaacson, who is president of ConocoPhillips Alaska. He began his career with Phillips Petroleum Company in Bartlesville, Oklahoma in 1986 as a geophysicist in upstream technology. He held various exploration and development positions in the company, including assignments in Houston, Odessa, and Stavanger. In 2002, he became manager, New Ventures Exploration, and then transitioned to manager upstream project authorization and performance. In 2006, he moved to Alaska, where he first held the role of manager, Alaska Exploration, and later as vice president, commercial assets with accountability for non-operated pipeline and Cook Inlet assets. In 2010, Erec assumed the role of president, Qatar, for the project completion, startup, and the first year production for the QG3 JV. You might have to explain what that stands for, what that is. He then moved to Jakarta in 2012 as president and general manager, Indonesian business unit. In 2016, he became vice president, Rockies business unit. In 2018, he became vice president, Gulf Coast BU, responsible for the development and operations of the company's Eagle Ford and offshore Gulf of Mexico assets. He assumed his current position in January 2021. Erec earned a BS degree in geophysical engineering from the Colorado School of Mines in 1986, and he currently is the chair of the Alaska Oil and Gas Association Board of Directors. So we're so grateful for Erec joining us tonight. Let me introduce Dr. Mark Myers, who's been engaged in Arctic research, resource management, and policy for 4 decades. Mark is serving on his second term as commissioner with the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. And if you don't know, that's an independent federal agency that advises the government on Arctic issues and Arctic research. He's the principal of My Energies, where his work has included supporting U.S. State Department efforts for capacity building in government resource ministries in the Arctic, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, Africa, and South America. Previously, he served in leadership positions with the state of Alaska, here at the University of Alaska, and the U.S. Department of Interior. These positions included Director of the U.S. Geological Survey, Alaska Commissioner of Natural Resources, and Vice Chancellor for Research here at UAF. State Geologist and Director of Oil and Gas. He has served on advisory committees for the Department of Energy, including the National Petroleum Council and the Methane Hydrate Committee. He's also been involved with the Arctic Council, serving as a member of the U.S. delegation for the 2015 Arctic Council Senior Arctic Officials Meeting. And as a member of the U.S. delegation to the Sustainable Development Working Group and the Scientific Cooperation Task Force. He served as a principal on the steering committee for the U.S. Global Change Research Program and as a member of the U.S. Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. Early in his career, he worked as a petroleum geologist for major oil companies and the state of Alaska. And he holds BS, MS, and PhD degrees in geology. So thank you, Mark, for being here as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Lovecraft. Thanks.
So thanks, everybody. I'm going to launch right into some of the questions that we've talked about. And the first one is one, you feel free to wander a bit. It's about your personal and professional trajectories and how you came to be in your current positions. So past guests have shared when they sort of recognized they wanted to be leaders, or moments in time where leadership seemed like something that interested them, or your fields. I mean, you diverge, but you have this background, real interest in, geophysics and mining and petroleum. And so if you'd like each in turn to give us a bit of your history, what brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, I'll jump right in here. First, I'll go back a little bit. and not just where kind of leadership started, but just kind of really what drove me to the field that I'm in today. I grew up in Colorado, and I was along the Front Range. And I grew up in Colorado at a time when it was a lot less populated than it is today. And so I had a lot of freedom, even growing up on the edge of Denver, to get on my bicycle, and I could ride my bike from where my house was over to the edge of the mountains, where you really started to see the geology as you had this big uplift at the Front Range. And so I wasn't too far from a place called Red Rocks, and you got the gorgeous Morrison Formation there and all the layers kind of coming out, and you ride across this big hogback to get there, where the Dakota Formation had dinosaur footprints, and you could go and scramble around there and see if after a big rainstorm, you could see freshly exposed slabs where you had dinosaur footprints. And so I always found that fascinating, and so living there and the opportunity to explore unhindered really created this love of the outdoors, love and interest in geology and understanding kind of what's going on, what makes the world what it is that we see today, and what makes it interesting. So then through high school, I ended up finding out that I was pretty good at math and physics, and I knew I wanted to go to university, but really didn't have the means to wander very far from home. So I selected and applied to just one place. It was the Colorado School of Mines in Golden, Colorado, because it was 8 miles from my house. And that way I could live at home and not have to pay, room and board, that I could just, cover tuition and go to university. So I started there undecided, but then ultimately combined the math and physics with the geology side and came up with geophysics. And so then that kind of launched me on the road. I ended up going to work for Phillips Petroleum. I chose them because in talking to them, they like to move their people around, and they gave them the opportunity to work internationally and see different, sedimentary basins, different geology on a global standpoint. And I found that fascinating because it really gave you context to be able to see stuff here, there, and start to tie it all together. And then also key to that was understanding different cultures on a global aspect. Found it fascinating, living in Norway, living in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, how all the cultures are different. Some are very individualist and rugged, individualism like we have here in Alaska. Some are much more collective and do things, decision making on a group basis, which ultimately informed leadership skills later on by understanding how these different communities work together and how they decided stuff and what was important to them. So, you got a little bit of the history of bouncing around the world, but the places that I really enjoyed most was living in Norway, in Stavanger, and then also here in Alaska, and really saw it as a fantastic opportunity to come back up here to Alaska, about 4 years ago, and to a place that I really enjoy. So when I look back at my career, I started out on the technical side and really enjoyed detailed geophysics. Just loved diving into all of the nooks and crannies, understanding what's going on. And then ultimately doing exploration and development, it was putting a puzzle together because you had a bunch of different pieces and you all disparate information and you're trying to figure out what's going on with something that you can't see. And through those early teams of different disciplines coming together, had the opportunity to fill leadership voids when they materialized. You had a team of like 4 or 5 folks, and without really an assigned leader, so a leadership void would materialize. And I always found myself kind of stepping into that void. And then ultimately that led to more formal positions as team leaders on the technical side. And then, just ever increasing responsibility with leadership, all on a technical side. When I was going to school, other than the technical courses, one of the things I really enjoyed was economics. I had mineral economics and I had, micro and macroeconomics, kind of your classic classes that you take. But just understanding what drives economies, what drives decision-making, from a personal standpoint, from a business standpoint, was something that I really enjoyed. So as I was running down that technical leadership path, I started becoming more and more interested in what drives the business decisions. And so because I had that interest, I spent a lot of time learning about all of the economic analysis, the metrics we use for decision-making from a business standpoint, long-term strategy, what makes a good project, what doesn't make a good project, how you come up with a business plan. And that ultimately led towards running assets. So I kind of moved away from the technical side and jumped into that. And then as I progressed up that ladder, the one thing that you become more and more involved with is people management, developing people, developing teams, developing skills, taking different functions and pulling them together so that you're all working together and complementing each other. And, that became really critical to having effective teams, effective projects, and, being able to solve problems, together. And so, really found I liked that aspect of it, and that I was good at that, together with the longer term strategy on what decisions we had to make from a business standpoint. So it ended up really being just kind of evolution. And each job, you took a little bit from that job that you learned and applied it towards the next job. And the whole time, just pursuing things that you were interested in. Because, I found for me, if I pursued things I was interested in, I really spent the time needed to understand those and, master those. And by investing that time, you become good at it. And then that way you excel in that position and it leads to something else.
It's always easier to make yourself work when you're interested in what you're working on.
Exactly.
Sure. Mark, how about yourself? What do you think of as key turning points in your trajectory? And you've dipped in and out of public service.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another interesting layer to build on.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels to what Eric just described. I'm a geologist, he's a geophysicist. And so I think a lot of people get into those areas because of their love of the outdoors, love of nature, and natural curiosity. They also generally are good in science and math. And so those combinations, and then exploring that's important. So when I thought about what am I going to say here tonight, first of all, I don't like talking about myself. I don't think most people do, but so I had to really think through how I would describe the journey. So I went through that carefully in my mind, and then I went to Copilot, AI. I put the questions in verbatim with no advice. And it gave me a beautiful example of leadership that I could come up here and parrot, and you would think I'm a real expert on leadership. Bottom line, I wouldn't be. I think leadership comes from experience, background, having to make hard decisions, and holding yourself accountable. So the bottom line is the speech is cheap. The actions are really, really important. And as you go through life, making those decisions and learning from the mistakes you've made, learning from what's worked, learning from others becomes really critical. So for me, I think there's two paths: the path to leadership and the path to the fields I've been involved with. Starts out, I knew in my life I wanted to do something that would be meaningful for society. That was always important to me. I also, as Eric did, I love science. I love history. And I love the outdoors. So I said, I'm going to find something I can do outdoors. And I was really curious about rocks always, because rocks held hidden life. You'd see the fossils, you'd look at all the history, look at the variation, and then you look at the ecosystem associated with them, and it all kind of fit together or didn't fit together. So it was really exciting for me as a kid to think about those things. Why in the Arctic? Well, when I was undergraduate, I was living on the Mississippi River area in Wisconsin, went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I had a professor that had a trip up to the north, up to the Yukon and then into Alaska. And it was like a 6-week summer course or longer. So we got to traverse much of North America, but the highlight was getting into a remote part of the Yukon where their mountains were there and climbing those mountains and looking at what was for you, that history before you, the incredible vistas, the environment, the wildlife, but also the rocks. And the rocks were telling you a story of hundreds of millions of years of history. They had beaches exposed in them, paleo beaches. They had coral reefs from a different period of time. They had big glacial deposits and active glaciers on top. You walk through that and you're looking at 100 million years of this planet's history or more, all compact in one story. Later on, as I did a lot of geologic field work, I'll just say there have been moments of aha that teach you a lot, taught me a lot. One was working along the Colville River up north slope of Alaska and in a gravel bar, finding dinosaur bones on the natural gravel bar, laying right next to Pleistocene mammals and Miocene horse bones and modern caribou bones, all mixed together, all looking as fresh as the other one right there. You're thinking that is one surface in this current time, but what is it telling you? It has 100 million years of life exposed in this one place, one site. And then you look at the outcrops, you can see where the material's coming from, when you see the geology of an ancient paleo river sitting exactly where the current river system is. And on top of that, ocean sediments that came in afterwards and the glacial sediments and the permafrost and tundra on top of that. That's quite a story to be able to look at. And to understand that and unravel that, it takes a lot of science. You have to do the chemistry, the geochemistry. You have to look at the layers of the rock. You have to look at the fossils in the rock. You have to look at the age of the rock. So when you start looking at that and put all that stuff together, you have a nice puzzle. But when you recognize, when you see it on the flat surface, that you are looking at a very compressed version, it's only a small portion of what really is there. So geologists have to be detectives. And I love that piece of it. They have to look at patterns and they have to look for anomalies. And so that was really exciting for me. And that said, the combination of coming up to this country and seeing how incredible the surface is, the geology, the people, but also seeing the amazing geology said, I got to come back here. So I swore I would come back there. At the same time, I was an undergraduate, we had the Arab oil embargo. That's history for most folks. But where the Arabs basically put an embargo on the US having oil. We didn't produce enough oil in the country to meet our needs. And there were huge lines at gas stations, prices shot up. So energy in the early 70s was a really big thing. So what if I was thinking, okay, I love this geology and the oil piece of it could really help the country. So I could do some good. So I went to work for a major oil company. At the time, I worked for Chevron for a little while and then for ARCO. And I picked ARCO because I knew they had operations in Alaska and they basically agreed to send me up to Alaska. So that's how I got up here. So I spent about 10 years in the industry and there are a lot of posts that I love and I learned a lot of lessons. One of the lessons is there's a lot of risk in drilling an oil and gas prospect. Most will be unsuccessful. So how do you manage risk? How do you work in interdisciplinary teams of engineers and scientists and environmental scientists to put together a prospect? And then how do you test the prospect? You know, you sit there, you're a geologist, you're on the rig, and I was fortunate to have a few discoveries, being the primary geologist for a couple of discoveries on the North Slope. But you got the opportunity to see your own ideas. And this giant equipment, this giant oil rig's up there, and it's testing your scientific hypothesis. And you're sitting there, and you're anxious as heck because the well's drilling down, you're seeing information, but you're having to see if you're successful. And then I had the aha moment. This was decided before there was any people on the planet. The geology of this is ancient. The rocks we're looking at are 90 million years old or older. And the oil was created and migrated in long before humanity existed. And I'm anxious. So the lesson of timing and how the world works and what we can expect, calm down. My leadership lesson from that was calm down. It will happen when it happens. This is a process that existed a long time ago that you're tapping into. So learn and respect those, understand those processes, and also to understand the scale of time that you have. So that was a really good lesson for that. Well, after a while, I decided I wanted to, I felt I really wanted to do geologic field work. I did about 20 seasons of work on the North Slope, but then I got asked to join the state and become the director of oil and gas for the state. And I thought, do I really want to do this? And I thought, again, what I'm trying to do the public good. It's important the state is strongly represented, and that is our income source, and that and so I was willing to do that. And so I took that job. Turned out it was a very difficult job as leader of the state for oil and gas, because you're negotiating companies with state employees over hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases. And you have to know the geology, you have to have skills in engineering, you have to be reasonable, you have to strike a balance between the state's interest and the industry interest. And it can be very difficult to do that in a politically charged environment. So in my job, I learned how to try to navigate that, how to build. I built technical teams. I got salary raises. I stole some of the companies in Alaska's people that didn't want to move out. And we built up a really good seismic interpretation capability, geological capability, engineering capability. And so I was pretty pleased. And then you have to deal with legislatures and governments. And now you're trying to explain these complex things to people that want to cut the budget. So you really have to understand as a leader how to explain very complex things to people that don't have technical backgrounds or don't understand these things. In the oil industry, they understand it. They're professionals. But in the legislature or within often political appointees within an administration, they don't have that skill set. So you do the best you can. And then sometimes things get crosswise. So we had experience in about 2005 where the state was negotiating for a gas line with the oil companies, and the legislature had given the state authorities to negotiate on certain items and not on others. Well, the governor got really concerned about getting the deal done before the next election, and he started to cut corners. And he really, he went well beyond in negotiations what we were allowed to with the legislature. Well, as oil and gas director, and my boss, who was the DNR commissioner, we worked on this, and we said, well, we can't accept it. So we tried to explain to the governor that we can still renegotiate, but you don't have the authority here, legal authority, and we had legal help to support us. He wouldn't accept that, and we talked to him very nicely and said, please help us, we need to negotiate this. He said, no, I'm the quarterback of the team, and we're going to do it this way. So I resigned, along with several other people. And it was a hard decision. I did not want to embarrass the governor. He wanted him to be successful. But as an ethical thing, the state was doing the wrong thing. The companies were better negotiators in this case, but it wasn't the quality of the negotiations. It was that we stepped across the legal boundary. And I was determined that I couldn't be a part of that. And we knew that. So it was a really tough thing. But a lesson I learned was you have sometimes where you have to make a really tough decision, and it's going to change your career path. And so it did. And a few months after that, the FBI came in and arrested a bunch of people who had taken bribes from various service companies. And so that's part of history. But it was one of those things where you're in leadership, it's not fun. You don't want to be in this position, but you have to make a critical decision. So that was another really important lesson for me. Well, it turned out that I ended up from that job getting a call from the White House. I was thinking, no, the governor's the same party as the president. I'm going to look for a private sector job somewhere. And I get a call from the White House asking me, would you consider becoming director of the U.S. Geological Survey? And for geologists, that's the #1 job in the world. And I'm going, I think this is a crank phone call. I don't think this is real. Anyway, turns out I went through the process kind of blindly. And I was very honest in my interviews of what I could do and what I couldn't do. I was very concerned that, because this is a scientific organization, that I would need to maintain the scientific integrity within a politically charged environment. And they assured me I would have scientific authority and they would not compromise the science results. And that made me say yes to the job. Well, in that job, all of a sudden I went from managing 150 people to manage 10,000 scientists and engineers, 400 offices around the world, and very broad in its scientific mission, not just energy and mapping and resources. They have full satellites. They have thousands of biologists. They do water hydrology work around the world, and they're known internationally as the premier organization that does these things. So here I am, with my Alaska background, and now I'm thrust into this big job. And the thing I learned first and foremost, and the advice I got out of that, was listen. You have world-class experts now working for you. They really understand what they're doing. So my job is to understand first and foremost. So leadership, in my opinion, one of the highest qualities of a leader is listen. And listen very carefully, because there's a lot of good things. The other thing is time. You simply do not have enough time to deal with everything when you get to the scale of the organization. I'm sure Eric can attest to that. You have to make choices of how you spend your time. And you don't usually get to spend the times on the things you're most interested in, but the things that need to work on. So leadership requires you to shift focus to things that need to be done and that are either problems or huge opportunities, and let other stuff go. And in that case, your delegation, you really have to delegate and you have to trust the people. You have to communicate clearly to people in those situations, what you're doing and why you're doing it. And you have to be willing to take criticism from them. You have to have an open door, because again, you're working with some of the smartest people in the world, and you're in the room with them. And if you want to have any credibility and you want to be successful, being humble and listening is one of the key things I would say. But it's like drinking from a fire hose. You have an incredible opportunity to learn in these situations. So when you get those opportunities, there is a mutual exchange that's very, very positive. And I had some very fortunate things happen. I got to meet with the president and convince him to spend $1.5 billion on Landsat satellite. Our satellites are running out. Secretary, we couldn't get the money in the budget without the president's approval, and the Department of Interior couldn't afford it. So he set me up with a lunch with the president, and I got to explain to him, and we got the funding for the next Landsat satellite. One of the reasons we did that is we made an early decision. I made a decision to release all the Landsat data for free. And that was about $4 or $5 million hit to my organization. But in order for it to be used effectively, we had to provide it to people around the world, because it was the only long-term record of the entire globe quarterly that we had in the world. And issues of climate, issue of environment, issues of resource management, water in the western states, natural hazards and disasters, it was critical to those missions. So it was so critical. And folks that couldn't afford to buy it were using lower resolution satellites and lesser observations. So when we did that, we took a hit internally, but the use grew by 2, now it's 3 orders of magnitude in terms of the amount of Landsat data that gets used. And that made such a strong case for launching the next one, that the president understood that when we talked to him, and we got the next satellite. So again, making those decisions, those linked decisions, they're hard decisions to make, because we were going to internally make less revenue. But in the end, we got that next satellite, and the next one after that came. So the program was solid.
In which president? This would have been.
This was under Bush.
This was Bush, I was thinking. And then because the satellite data is available, does that mean any geologist or company can use that satellite data like with a subscription, or like
For
how?
free, just download the data.
Just absolutely.
Anyone
as
in
long
the world
as you
can
could download it.
Anyone in the world can download it. And it took us about $1 million to upgrade our servers to be able to handle the pull. But one of the cool things was later in a conference, I heard someone ask, why haven't you done Google Earth for the oceans? And the answer was, we didn't have Landsat. When we released Landsat, Google was the first one, and they sucked our servers dry. They took all our capacity. But the bottom line, that created Google Earth. And now, of course, they've gotten high resolution data and other data sets, but they confirmed that. So that was and then interesting enough, a year later, I was meeting with the head of the Canadian mapping organization. And his comment was, we don't need to do that mapping. We have Google Earth. And I turned to him and said, where do you think the data comes from? So again, it's amazing when you are able to listen. And that wasn't releasing the data came as a recommendation to me. It wasn't something that I thought of, but I listened and then I fought for it. And we got it through Congress and got the president. And so bottom line is you see every once in a while your stuff really works. And you really, the pride of leadership is to actually see something that's permanent and helps. So the lesson I learned was listen a lot, be strategic in what you ask for, and recognizing there are costs to that as part of leadership. When I came to the university, back to university, here I learned how a lot of things. Again, you're always broadening your knowledge as Vice Chancellor of Research. But one thing I learned in an academic situation, you have a lot of experts that are really define their expertise narrowly. Getting them to work together collaboratively on interdisciplinary projects is really difficult. I learned how hard that is to convince people. Again, a lot of listening, but a lot of prodding is necessary because our academic structure is narrow, 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 focus, focus, be the expert on your one thing. So to get that cross-disciplinary piece that's so critical, it takes a lot of work. So being able to communicate and convince people, because you don't order professors to do stuff, you convince them that it's in their interest, or the grant funding is available if they can do it. You can stare at Hertz. But that's part of the job, is really working with a lot of people that have very strong expertise, but it may be narrow, and getting them to work together. So you have to be a bit of a facilitator as a leader, and you have to lay breadcrumbs so that they come to the realizations themselves. So there's a lot of subtle pieces I've found to leadership that I've learned in the lessons. So I'm talking too much, but the last job was DNR commissioner.
No, and let's save the commissioner
Okay.
component because it leads into the next question.
Yep.
But before that, both of you talked quite a bit about risk. And I'm curious if you might expand on that, your story about risking, right, the public release of information or testing your thesis, or I think of also this notion of risk, you know, with you're moving around so much, right? Taking these different positions, you both did, but, you know, moving internationally and being willing to experience very different ways of being, which not all people can do, right? So how much of a role do you think risk plays in shaping leadership? You know, because there's the old, you're both telling wonderful stories. And I think of just that common thing we often say when someone tells a story, well, if you didn't die, right, then it's funny. Or, you know, and if you did, then we don't tell the story, right? It's just never heard of. But that's meant to be a bit of a joke. But I mean, the risk is real, both outdoors, professionally, right, to your own reputations. So if you could each maybe share a little bit about a specific example where the risk either didn't pay off and you learned something, or where the risk, you know, did pay off. And I'll turn to Eric first, because we just got for sure a payoff from Dr. Myers. What's something really risky that you had to push through and that helped forge you as a leader? Because leaders have to take risks.
Yeah. So you mentioned, you know, the risks associated with moving. So, I mean, I'll take a look at it from two aspects. One of it is kind of jumping from, you know, culture to culture to culture, job around the world. The other one is taking a look, you know, something that Mark kind of touched upon was just exploration risk. When you go out there and you spend a lot of money to go out and drill a well. Mark hit upon a really true point, is that you really learn when you're challenged. When things are easy, you don't learn. And so if a project goes through and there is no challenges at all, you learn much less than if something's going through and you're really challenged and things aren't going right. And because that's when you really reflect upon what happened. You have all those challenges and you figure out, okay, we can do this better next time by doing this, this, or this. So as I've moved around the world quite a bit, you know, I grew up in Colorado, and then, you know, jumped in the car and drove off with a bed and a TV and ended up in Oklahoma and spent 4 years there. And then moved down to Houston and started doing regional exploration out of Houston. And then one day I was at the office, I just bought a house, and my supervisor was walking, or actually was my boss's boss, was walking down the hallway. And he said, "Oh, Eric, so when are you leaving?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he looked at me and he says, "Oh shit, oh shit," and just turned around and started walking the other way. So then I went to my supervisor and found out that they were transferring me to West Texas, out to the Midland Basin. And I had just closed on a house the day before and had just moved in that night. So it was, scary at that point because I'm moving off to something else where I didn't know anybody. After 5 years there, I decided that I've learned about all I can there. I need to do something else. And so moved to Norway. First time ever in Europe was when I was landing to start working there. And spent 5 years there, met and married my wife there. And we started a family, then moved to Texas, and then back to Alaska, and then to the Middle East. And so all of those changes, there was risk for me going into new roles that I didn't have a significant amount of experience in. So I knew that next role was really going to push me. But at the same point in time, it was also really going to push my family too, because we had a family started and we were jumping from culture to culture to culture, and with really without that safety net of having broader family with you or a circle of friends even, other than the friends there at the office. And so when I left Alaska and went to Qatar, and so the question was, or earlier when they were kind of going through the biology, you have to tell us what the JV for QG3 was. Mm-hmm. So I went from Alaska here, and then boom, they send me over to Qatar, and I was the country manager for Qatar. And so I was responsible for all of ConocoPhillips activities and our face in that country. So the first time I had done that, and it's in a foreign culture in the Middle East, where I am now representing the company, and it was uncomfortable to begin with. And it really pushed me to start to figure out, I need to understand this culture. I need to understand what their drivers are. I need to understand how to communicate and what's important to them, because ultimately everything has to be a win-win. And you can't go through life and be successful if it's I win, you lose. You've got to figure out how to fulfill everybody's needs and then drive towards solutions that resolve those. And so in Qatar Gas 3, that's one of the big giant mega trains. So one of the LNG trains that makes liquefied natural gas that then we were sending to Europe or Japan at the time, because the Japanese had just gone through the big earthquake in the Fukushima accident. And so we ended up diverting a lot of our cargoes to Japan, which was really beneficial for them because they had shut down all the nuclear power plants at the time. But so there was always risk with each one of those moves, but it was figuring out, even though you're uncomfortable, how to embrace that and learn about those various cultures, what makes them, tick, how you communicate effectively, particularly as we went to Indonesia and we went into a very collective society. When you went to have discussions with the government or people in your organization, no one was ever direct about anything. They always talked in circles around it, and you had to figure out what they were talking about in order to figure out what the issue was. Because they would never tell you if there was an issue, but they would talk around the issue. So then you started to realize, something's going on here.
We're telling you just in their own
In their
cultural
own
way
way.
in which
So
they talk about those things.
You had to figure that out and get comfortable with it. So every time you moved into that new culture, there was that risk about, am I going to be successful in this culture? Am I going to be able to make it work? But then it's investing the time to understand the people, their drivers, and then get to know them. Get to know people personally and get to know them, well, and start to establish, one thing that Mark hit on was trust. And really working with your stakeholders and establishing, trust. And so as you're working through issues where there is risk, whether it's personal or professional, that you can start to minimize that. And so, there's that was that component about moving from place to place. And, like Mark, I was heavily involved in the exploration game for most of, for the first 15 years of my career. And in there, you spend all the time doing all of the work with the realization that depending on what basin it is, there might be a 1 in 5, 1 in 4 chance of success. Or if it's a completely rank wildcat out in the middle of nowhere, it might be a 1 in 10 chance of success. And it is getting your team comfortable with the risk associated with going in and doing that, because quite often as geoscientists, we fall in love with our ideas and we really don't we don't always fully appreciate the risk and what we don't know, because we come up with a model in our mind that this is the way things are going to work. This is the way it's going to be. And so too often we're shocked when things don't turn out that way. From the subsurface standpoint, when you drill a well out in the middle of nowhere. And so it's getting comfortable with that risk, getting getting management comfortable with the risk that in all likelihood, probably from a probabilistic standpoint, this is going to fail. If it's successful, hey, that's great. Then we have to move to that next step. But getting everyone to understand the business model around failure, that you're going to fail most of the time, but then that one time bails out all those other failures.
Right. And planning for the worst, then all the surprises are great.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
And
exactly.
no, and I'm going to move this to the moving around. We have quite a few folks who take the class who are also in the military or in the service. So there's been a lot of discussion in the class about, when they move from post to post, or they're working with new team members coming in, new recruits, new folks. They talk a lot about how they give of their own self some leadership to ensure that teamwork, right? That leadership isn't something that you just hold on to and cling to. You actually really want to make your team all leaders as well. And that's reflected, I think, in some of what you're saying. So when I think of the military, or I think of like a corporate, agenda, I could see how that carries through moving, right? Or carries through different job positions. So Mark, what was it that you carried through your very different jobs that kept you inspired, right? Like you didn't have a constitutional duty as a soldier, or the company, bottom line that helped you think about these risks. What drove you, or what helped to keep you going as a leader in your roles? And then if you want to talk about the U.S. ARC, please.
Okay. Yeah. I think one of the things is the ability to learn new things, see new things, maybe influence to some degree. You realize influence is difficult because everything's transient and the forces will want to pull it back to where it was. So often your victories are only temporary when you see them in reality. Every once in a while, you see the paradigm shift occur. But the fascination with the information and then working on issues like water quality, getting that breadth, understanding the ecosystem services issue, understanding balance is one of the key things. When I was Commissioner of Natural Resource for the state, you managed 100 million acres, basically the size of the state of California in scale. And those ecosystems are very different. And the needs of the people in Alaska, the needs of the national system are all different. The needs of the industry are different. So you have inherent conflict, and you're responsible to balance that conflict in a way that is as win-win as you can make it. but people often don't see it that way. They see it as winner take all. And so Alaska can be very polarizing in that way. So the wins are when you're able to explain and make it work together. The challenges are, how do you communicate in such a way? And how do you force a decision into a data-driven decision? To me, that's very important. You know, I think we're all entitled to our own beliefs, but we're not entitled to our own facts. So you've got to ground decisions in real data. So thinking ahead of time, that's why research is so important to me, so that we have the research in place at the time we need it. So that can inform, it's not going to be the total reason for the decision. You know, politics, belief structures, ideologies, legal requirements all play a role, but you want to be able to at least get a common frame of reference to discuss the issue. And when you can't, and often in Alaska issues, we can't, because we're now at the point in our society where we don't want to acknowledge those facts unless they're convenient, or I want to manage the subset of facts that support my case and not the other case. So I think one of the rewards is when you're smart enough on the research side to be able to get the data ahead of time. So when you make the decision, you can do what you can to at least discuss it in a common frame of reference so you can make some progress. It's very hard. It's very hard to do that. It's very hard to do it in government because you often don't have the resources. It's hard to do it in industry because you have competitors. But it's very, very important to me. And so being driven by, you know, the information and understanding that science and information. The exciting thing to me is when I see opportunities for real positive growth through advancements in technology or research that can help. So that's what kind of drove me, was what can I do to facilitate it? And with the ARC, I get to do some of that work in areas. So to me, that's exciting things.
Yeah, no, and it leads nicely into the second question, which either of you could take first. And one of the things we're doing, right, with calling it Arctic Leadership is really thinking about how the different students, but you know, also the faculty and then our public guests, what is it about the circumpolar north, and then you can be Alaska specific if you like, that might require a different kind of leadership? So for example, Mark, you mentioned, you know, just the very different, we're huge, right? And we have all these different ecoregions. Each ecoregion has, you know, a people that has lived there for millennia, and who may have very different approaches towards leadership or the way, or stewardship, or these different ways of thinking. And then you have, right, all the, you know, settlers, we all came in and we all have our own different ideas. But is there one thing that you can think of, like you also have the experience in Norway, and I know, Mark, you've traveled other places in the circumpolar north. What is it about? I think of it from a cryospheric perspective, right? I'm always thinking about places where there's snow and ice, and that makes, you know, for different risks. It makes for different ways we think about the world. But is there something that in your experiences you felt needs a special kind, or have to have a certain quality as a leader, being so far up, so removed essentially from the mid-latitudes?
You know, where?
Sure.
And you've been to the hottest and the coldest in the sense too.
I went from the Arctic to the desert to the jungle and back to the Arctic. So when I look at it, it's the logistics of being up here. When you look at the Arctic, it's so sparsely populated, very low density of people in the region, low density of infrastructure. And so ultimately, logistics of doing anything up here are very challenged. You look at doing business in the lower 48, and if you need something, if you need people, they're easy to get. You can get it relatively fast, you know, particularly services. Up here, we're at the end of a long road. If you're going to get something from the lower 48, it's it's got to go across truck or across rail to Seattle. Seattle seems to be the starting point for about everything. And then from Seattle, it comes up via barge. And then once it hits here, then your truck or train, you know, if it's ultimately going to the North Slope, to Fairbanks. And then you touch it again here, then it gets on the haul road and moves up. And then once you get up to the North Slope, if you're going to construct something, that's where another something that's very specific about being in the Arctic. It's the environment that we're in, ecosystems that we're in, they're fragile. And so when we go out there and we construct something, we're doing it off of ice. We're building a new pipeline. We're putting our, what we call VSMs, our vertical support members. So those are the racks that the pipes sit on. And we build those racks 7 feet high. That way they don't hinder caribou movement, underneath for your pipelines. And, so ultimately you have to do all of that off of ice. You work like mad to construct that ice so that, your time on the tundra doesn't damage the tundra because everything's frozen. But then all of that effort, all of that expenditure turns around and melts away and goes back into the local, the local lakes for that next year. And then you do it all over again. So ultimately, when you work in the Arctic, because of those remote logistics, it makes you to have to be very clever about the way you work. So I would say one of the things that's a defining leadership trait for folks living and working in the Arctic is ingenuity. And, that's critical as you think about what you got to do to get stuff done. And it's just like the people that have been here forever, what it took for them to survive. I've got someone that that I work with who grew up in Barrow, and they talked about the ingenuity and flexibility and tenacity that you have to have every day. One day a can of coffee or a can of Hills Brothers has got coffee in it. The next day it's full of seal oil. And, it's just, you have to have that flexibility with everything that you do up there on the slope, and ingenuity, with regard to how you use things, because the logistics are so hard to get things, up there and done. And then ultimately, you have to roll in those cultural differences that you brought up. You have to understand the cultural drivers for the people in the area, what's important to them. Up on the North Slope up here, it's the ecosystem, it's the subsistence, it's the sustainability. Over in Norway, with the offshore development, it was the fishing. It was, that was their way of life for millennia. And so it's understanding that and aligning what you do with the communities, with your stakeholders, so that everybody is comfortable with the sustainability of what of how you develop. One of the things that we have in Alaska and that we have that we had in Norway as well, is we had a strong regulatory environment. That strong regulatory environment created the sustainable way that we develop in Alaska and in Norway today. We do it better than anywhere else in the world. When you think about sustainability, when you think about small footprint, when you think about how we minimize impact to the environment, nowhere else in the Arctic do they do that type of development, well, other than Canada. So if you think about Alaska, Canada, and Norway, and all of that folds into the special circumstances that we have in the Arctic, and the fragility of the ecosystems and how we have to treat those.
Yeah, and as a political scientist, I appreciate your mention of the regulatory environment, but it's very true, right, that in this discussion, and our state legislature has recently been talking quite a bit about that, right, that with the advance of wanting to we could say just increase drilling and exploration from the current federal administration, there's been some pushback, right? Because businesses need that certainty, right, of a regulatory environment in order to know what they can and cannot do. That, a lot of times people don't understand that aspect, and it's even an economic aspect, right? That if you're in a strong regulatory environment, you can actually move to profit as a company more quickly, right? As opposed to always wondering if you might have to pay for a lawsuit, or you're not sure what the guidance is that you're under. So I think that currently that regulatory environment and the challenges to it are really this open area that a lot of Alaskans are thinking about. Do we, I don't know, when I go that direction, Mark, I'm taking you now a bit away from the other question, what's special about the Arctic, but you were in part of the agency culture that set and followed those regulations. So please, can you combine them both? Maybe a little bit about regulation and what's special about the
Well,
North?
I'll start building on your comment about the cryosphere.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that Alaska has, of course, it's a very large area, but the cryosphere means that subtle changes in temperature make huge differences in ecosystems. Secondly, the ecosystem services in Alaska, for the most part, are non-impaired. You can't, if you want to look at the number of undammed rivers in the United States, almost all of them are in Alaska. There's very seldom you can find a river. There are a few in the lower 48 that aren't dammed and controlled. The reality is in Alaska, very few are. So our ecosystems are intact, and an influence in one part of the ecosystem has a dramatic impact in another part over a huge distance along our rivers, along our coastlines. And then the cryosphere change means that change is set. Change is happening very rapidly in terms of permafrost thaw, glacial thaw, sea ice, and the feedback mechanisms are largely to accelerate the rate of change. And that affects our community infrastructure. It affects the ways and the requirements for development. It makes it very difficult. So that's those are really big challenges in terms of how to regulate. And generally, Alaska has pretty darn good regulations, but we have very different opinions linked to the other issue, and that is land ownership. So with the majority of the land in Alaska being federally owned, followed by the state, followed by native corporations, and private land being less than 1%, the parties have very different goals and management decides depending on who's in the White House, quite honestly. So in one case, it's pro-development, in the other case, it's pro-conservation, and it swings back and forth. That creates uncertainty, as you said, inherently with the state. The state has to balance, again, more so than the federal government, because the sole source of income to the state is through economic development and the federal government. Those are the major sources, with some in fishing. But primarily that resource development funds right now our government, because we do not have a diversified economy. So the state is generally more favorably disposed to it for practical reasons, but no one wants it in their backyard, to be honest. And that's a lower 48 problem as well. So we have a very fragile and rapidly changing ecosystem structure. We have tremendous natural resources, both natural and geological and biologically. We have amazing fisheries. We have lots of good things, and we're regulating them as best you can, but how do you regulate with the massive amount of change, particularly the biological resources? We also have tremendous geohazards. And so again, what standards do you use to protect the infrastructure? And when do you build infrastructure? So we have lots of unique challenges, but those resources give us lots of opportunities. But the goals of on the federal side, you're representing a national interest, not just an Alaska interest. And so that national interest is widely varied, from very pro-development to very anti-development and preservation. And that national interest plays a role because of the federal land ownership. And that's just the reality of it. So again, it's complicated. Again, I think our regulatory standards relative to many places in the world are very, very good. But with our changing environment, how do you manage adaptively the changes that are occurring? It's very difficult.
And the goalposts are shifting or going into the ground, right? If they're
The resources are being affected rapidly, independently of the development, but development needs to be consistent in minimizing the impacts. But those impacts are changing.
Right. No, thank you. You stated it better. So yeah, we're about to go to question and answer, but really quickly, just each of you, if you had to briefly tell us what your leadership style is. Do you have a word, or have the folks you've led ever characterized your leadership style?
I'll jump in first. So if I look at it, it's open listening. And I think, Mark hit the nail on the head, and this is the way I do it, is that you listen first and you seek to understand. So we talked earlier about kind of moving from business unit to business unit around the world. You never jump in and just start making changes until you actually understand what's going on. It's you spend those first several months listening, and then you figure out, okay, what can I do to improve, or what can I do to make things more efficient? So it's having that open door policy. It's listening to people. It's developing a strong leadership team. It's establishing trust, because without trust, people aren't going to talk. And without people talking, you're not going to have collaboration on the leadership team. And so that's critical to get that dialogue flowing, to establish trust across your team, across your organization. Be a strong leader, drive strategy, help people in their development. And, that's really what I strive towards. And I always take a look at the measure as a measure of my success. When I have a meeting, what is the communication like out there? Are people openly talking and enjoying that dialogue, or are they clamped up and sitting there waiting for the next shoe to drop? And so I think that, that's really important. You can't really excel if the people can't come to the office and feel like they're giving it their all and that they're being listened to.
And mistakes get hidden, right?
Yes.
When you don't have that trust, people tend to come into themselves, right? And that's the worst for any organization, right? If something goes wrong and no one knows about it. Do you have a leadership style, Mark?
Yeah, I'm a geek. So facts, facts, and more facts in data, data-driven
Yeah.
is critical. Transparency and openness are the next thing. And then recognizing bias in my own viewpoints in particular. Being smart enough to recognize that I got to get beyond my bias. I have to look at that fact pattern objectively. And also looking at the bias of the other people surrounding me or that are working on the issue. Are we looking at this? Is there a common frame of reference we can work this problem? And can we get the information? So then the policy piece of that's not based on the data, that's based on the ideology or based on the special needs or viewpoints, then we can talk about that. But
at least go forward from
yes,
that common
yeah.
thing. Yeah, fantastic. So we're going to open it up now to in the audience and online questions. And Dr. Boylan, I think, is going to drive with that.
Yeah. So we'll start with the room. Are there questions for our guests? We'll start here and then we'll go online. Yeah, Nicholas.
Hi, thank you both for coming and sharing with us and talking about your experience and your work in the corporate world and in the scientific world. There was a lot of conversation earlier about history and like this kind of focus on your stories and on where you've come from and also on the geology and the history of the planet. And I guess I was curious if you'll indulge me to like cast your minds maybe 15 years into the future to 2050. And I'm curious kind of what you think Alaska can or should look like from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, and especially taking Dr. Meyer's observations about the changes in the environment that are taking place here. Yeah, what are your kind of like high dreams, so to speak, for what Alaska can be like in 15 years, and what do you anticipate as well from a more realist perspective? Thank you.
So a lot of what I do in the Arctic Research Commission is try to look forward, to predict the research or the opportunities. In particular, I look for paradigm shifts to get away from the issues that we just talked about. One of the things I'm hopeful for is alternative energy in a very large scale for particularly in interior Alaska. And the one area that I see as the least studied and maybe could be the most effective is geologic hydrogen. That we may have a lot of hydrogen under the ground associated with the critical minerals that we also have that could be produced like oil and gas or could be stimulated in the shallow subsurface. If we could do that, then we have a low carbon fuel that could A, be used by our communities, but B, be used for transportation, could be used by could be used by the mining industry to build much cleaner mines. The other piece I see is our ability to observe and understand and model is increasing very rapidly. With respect to the AI I talked about, wasn't very good. It might have been pretty good with my leadership thing, but in other questions, it's not very good. But when you start looking at the capacity to manage information, the new sensors that are coming out, smaller sensors, the ability to gather immense amounts of data, our satellite communication and broadband that we're now getting means, and the micro sizing of sensors means we are going to have a very different worldview through observation. The other thing is quantum sensing. We can start looking at magnetic fields and gravimetric data and other data at very, very fine scales with immense accuracy. So we can start doing precision mining. You don't mine everything and make a bunch of waste rock. You mine only the zone. We can do, I think, more successful understanding of the material science that's going on with improvements in solar cells. Again, at a quantum level, material science is advancing really quickly. If we get to superconductivity at higher temperatures, you've changed the efficiency of the systems. Drones, the Ukrainian war has shown us that drones can be ubiquitous. What if we turn those to good? Then we have real-time observation of our environment. So you start seeing these changes, and you start seeing the sophistication. We can do development, we can do advanced development, and maybe we have that hydrogen out there instead of producing bulk ore that we ship out. We refine locally. We concentrate and refine more locally. Less transportation, less input, less waste rock. And all of a sudden, we open up a lot of opportunities for us. And if we get the energy to the communities, we dramatically improve the way of life, particularly low carbon sources. So that's my vision. I think we could get there. Will we, is the question.
Yeah, can we imagine no diesel barges, right? Or the pollution that comes from that in the communities. How about yourself? What if for the future?
Yeah, so I'll take Mark's technology and employ it. And because what I think are my vision of Alaska here 15 years from now is, a strong economic base, stability in our population. When you take a look at right now, our population has fallen. We're losing critical craft. Our students grow, they grow up, they go to university, and a lot of them leave. They'll leave Alaska, they'll go down to, I was with Sean Parnell last week at the Science and Engineering building at UAA, because we put out there a large gift to establish an endowment for research. And so I was there with all of the research students, going over their research and talking to them about what they're looking at. And Sean told me that one of the key things is we want to capture folks and bring them into the University of Alaska or the University of Alaska system, because if we can bring them in here, I think it was like 80% of them stay in Alaska. If they leave and go to school in the lower 48, only 30% of them would actually come back. And so when you think about our long-term prosperity, here in Alaska, we want stability of population. And in order to have that, you have to have stability of jobs. So you have the things that, that Mark mentioned with the technology creation that can provide that job stability. But there's also with our existing industries, like oil and gas on the North Slope, it's that consistent development that provides those jobs year in, year out. One of the big things is Fairbanks, used to be huge for craft labor, but the swings that we've had in the industries have had a lot of those folks end up leaving. What you really want to see is you want to see consistent development, so you have the ability to have long-term jobs, up here in Alaska, develop that craft, develop those technical skills, and provide opportunities for them to employ it. And so then that means you need to have regulatory stability, and you brought that up earlier. You can't swing your regulatory stability and expect long-term stability. You need to have fiscal stability. You can't swing your fiscals and then expect people to invest and stay around for the long run and trust you next time you say, oh no, it's different this time. So you need that regulatory stability, you need that fiscal stability, and then you need to find and develop the talent to stay here in Alaska and keep this economy thriving. And I think we can do that.
And the stable population, and if it grows, we can diversify the economy as well, right? Which
Exactly.
provides more security for different kinds of folks. Thank you both. Other questions from the floor, or shall we go online?
I've been really enjoying this leadership series so far. So thank you to the organizers and thank you to our speakers tonight for your insights. Both of you talked about the importance of data and history and knowing all of those things. And so I want to know how you reconcile the gas and oil industry's history of lack of transparency and not sharing their data correctly. And this is something that I'm still hearing about today. You know, the Alaska Gas and Development Corporation just signed a contract with Glen Farm that I've been hearing the legislators are complaining about the lack of transparency involved with that. So I was just wondering how you reconcile those things in order to complete your work. Thank you.
Is it to?
I think it's
Oh.
both of you. Yeah. I mean, there have been missteps and we have to deal with that. What do you both think about that? These non-transparent histories and, you know, I think Exxon Mobil would be the one that's in the sort of the shining lights, right, with lawsuits. But, you know, I'm not making a moral judgment, but petroleum, right, is big and it's dirty and it's intensive and it's extractive. And how do we reconcile that with the other aspects you've talked about too? Subsistence. I didn't mean to take your question. I apologize. I should leave the question as, I didn't get your name. Don't go on. Okay, as Mr. Hartman, I'm going to say, posed. What do you think?
You want me to go over?
You brought it,
go for
Vika.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's very important to have as much transparency as you can within the industry, with some exceptions, in terms of protect proprietary data in competitive environments. And the state has regulations on relative transparency, but we have very complex tax structure. We have a lot of moving parts to that, and a lot of that data is confidential. We have, no, we don't release seismic data. And I personally think that's a mistake, that there should be a period of time for the seismic data, maybe 10 years, and then release of data. It's been historically hard to get the state legislature to try to increase those standards. We also, though, do have a really good geological survey. We have a good division of oil and gas. Our Oil and Gas Commission releases the well logs on a regular basis. There's a 2-year delay. So some data sets are released. I would think the fiscal data is the most challenging data sets. And again, it's most companies want to keep their data proprietary. Most state legislators will be on one side of the fence or the other. So it becomes very difficult. It's because there is certainly proprietary value, but there's also complex tax systems that require immense amounts of data because they are inherently complex in the way they're designed. And I think we should have simpler tax systems that are more transparent, require less data, quite honestly. But you do state a real issue. There's often challenges. We've tried many times in legislation to open up some of those data sets, but it's very, you can't reach a consensus with the legislature and the governor, typically, my experience.
So when I think of, development, up on the North Slope, and, one of the things that we have to do is we have to go through the full permitting process. And that has, right now, the way that's set up is we go through lots of town halls, lots of public comment periods, and we are very open book about our development. our entire development plan is put out there with the permit process. And there's discussion of all of the mitigating factors that you have to put in there in order to actually get the permit to do the project. So you have the feedback from the community, the feedback from the company. You have the governmental agency, their comments coming in, and the footprint that they have in that. So ultimately, if you read these full permits and applications, there's no secrecy. It's all out there. Everything about the development, about what's going to happen, and all of the actions that are taking in order to mitigate impact. And so that whole discussion about secrecy about what we're doing up on the slope, the permitting process and everything that we have now, there isn't that. Now, there might be broader ones with regard to strategic things within the government that has to discuss. But when it comes down to actual development that we're seeking to do, it's pretty much it's pretty much out there with the permit, exactly what we're going to do. And so when you think about leadership up there on the North Slope with development, part of something that's important there is that stakeholder alignment, gaining trust, is that you have to do what you say you're going to do. Because if you don't do that, you don't establish that trust, and you'll lose your stakeholders, in the future. So you have to be ethical in the way that you work with all your stakeholders, and you have to have integrity to follow up and do what you say you're going to do. And that's something critical for us with our stakeholders as we go through and we talk about these mitigative actions, that we follow through and we complete all those.
An example of, would an example of a mitigative action be like when a well closes, or could you give an example of a mitigative action is all I'm asking.
Okay, yeah. So I think what
that's
you
an
were
example
talking
of that
about is like when you
trust.
P&A a well at the
Sure,
end.
yeah, you cap it off.
And that comes down to responsibility, integrity too, is following through on your obligations. And that's something that that we pride ourselves in. You'll have some companies that will go bankrupt and leave things undone. And that's obviously not us when we're up there executing. So as we kind of go through the whole permit process, you're working with local communities, and if there's like a subsistence concern, then there's the discussions about, well, what can we do to mitigate that impact? So if you think about some of the developments up there, it was, okay, the gravel roads are too high. They might impact animal movement. And so there's subsistence concerns about that. So it kind of comes back to the discussion around ingenuity. We worked with the community. We figured out, well, how high could they be? And then now on our latest project, we're building the roads with insulation within the gravel. Because normally you would build really high gravel because that had an insulatory effect, so you wouldn't melt the tundra or the permafrost underneath. So we're going out there, we're putting in a little bit of gravel, we're putting in insulation, and then less gravel on top than you would have had before, so you have lower profile roads. So you're working with the community in order to resolve that. Another good example was around pipeline height. And initially, a lot of the development on the North Slope, the pipe racks were very close to the tundra, or just a little bit above. So the caribou, when they had to go, they had to really kind of get down and twist to get up and through. And so with ConocoPhillips, we do a significant amount of biological research for all of the projects that we have in order to gain our permits. We do baseline surveys, we do animal monitoring for years afterwards. And so one of the things that we saw from going through and radio collaring a lot of caribous is that you want your pipelines to be at minimum, 7 feet off the ground in order to have unhindered caribou movement through and across the tundra. So as a result, we changed everything the way we do it from a mitigation effort. And so then we start building everything at 7 feet off the ground. We work with the the stakeholders in the villages to ensure that that works. And so those are the just a few of the types of examples. It's that to and from. It's working together to come up with a solution that works for both sides is what you have to have in order to be successful in the long run.
Sure. And if we as citizens don't like a regulatory environment, then it becomes incumbent on us, right, to speak to legislators or other decision makers to make that change. Excellent. Other thoughts, questions?
This one's for you, Mr. Isaacson. Sorry, I forgot your last name for a second. So I've read about ConocoPhillips' triple mandate on energy transition. The mandate calling for what you call responsible delivery of oil and gas production, delivery on competitive returns on and off capital, and doing so with a resilient, sustainable portfolio that enables you to achieve a net zero operating emissions ambition. And so I'm curious, what is net zero operating emissions ambition, and what does that look like in a petrostate of Alaska, and how does it differentiate from a commitment to a net zero future reality?
Yeah, so when you look right now at infrastructure that we have out there, you have a huge investment in infrastructure. So as you take a look at changes, there are incremental changes over time in order to get to where you want to be. And so that's why then there are the timelines associated with net zero. And that's why there's timelines out there in the future associated with that. So if we look at some of the changes that are being made, the first focus has been around reducing methane emissions. And so we joined the consortium focused on reducing methane emissions. And, like up here in Alaska, it's taking a look at all of our facilities, all of our pipeline operations, where could there be fugitive methane emissions, and then making the investments in order to eliminate those. So, that's just one step on that journey towards, net zero. And in different basins, there are different things that you have to deal with, from that aspect. Up here in Alaska, when you think about methane emissions, they're actually very, very low. And one of the reasons why is because of the Arctic environment. When we go out there and we design our facilities, you're designing most of your facilities for being inside. And so one of the key things, if you're designing for something inside, is you can't tolerate, the leakage of explosive gases, like methane. So you actually engineer things and design stuff so that you're in this inside environment, you won't have, methane emissions, for example. And so that is something that's very different as compared to the industry in other areas, like in a warm environment where they don't have that constraint. And so in your journey towards net zero, if you're going to be working to mitigate methane emissions, then you have to take a look at all of the instrumentation that was driven by gas pressure and swap out instrumentation. So that is part of that overall journey. So to answer your question, towards net zero, when we look at net zero for scopes 1 and 2, which is our own power or power purchased, then you're looking at all of those incremental changes that you have to identify, modify your equipment in order to get rid of those CO2 or CO2 equivalent gases, those greenhouse gases. And so, that's a process of finding those, eliminating those, and mitigating those. And we've made significant steps towards that from a methane standpoint, as well as taking a look at carbon dioxide emitters and start working through that list as well. Mark, I don't know if you wanted to add to that in any ways from what you see happening in the industry.
Yeah, I think one of the big questions will be when and if carbon sequestration is going to be required, either by regulation or by credit, right? Because then you would start looking at re-injecting CO2 produced from emissions from generators and compressors, which is inevitable, and actually capturing that and re-injecting it, and then in terms of processing as well. So that's a big question of what's going to happen in the future with respect to either credits or regulatory environment. Right now, I would say you're going to need to wait another 3-4 years to see what that answer looks like. But Prudhoe Bay is a place where you can sequester a significant amount of CO2. So that's one way that could get very quickly to lower the emissions. Our methane and CO2 emissions, obviously, our anthropogenic ones are dominantly within the oil infrastructure on the North Slope because we don't have much industry. So that's the place where you could really, you could do a fair amount, but there has to be an economic or regulatory incentive for it to happen. And so it's an open question still. I would say one of the big concerns in Alaska is the natural mechanism in terms of thawing and permafrost, in terms of methane hydrates, and the natural release of the system is far overwhelming in forest fires, of course, in the in the boreal forest. So we are releasing immense amounts of carbon. The other concern is typically our boreal forests have been absorbing carbon. It looks like they're switching to being that source of carbon, given all the fires and the permafrost thaw that's going on associated with them. So we have a natural cycle of release in the Arctic that's potentially huge and is switching. The ocean's ability to absorb carbon is decreasing as well as it warms. So we're starting to see a whole lot of natural system response to the warming climate that are producing a huge amount. So our net zero numbers are really hard. I mean, right now, a big chunk of that carbon is anthropogenic, but there's going to be a lot more natural carbon coming into the system as things warm. So I'm not sure how it looks when we're bailing with the thin wall and when we're not.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you so much. Join me in thanking Eric and Mark for being here.